All right. Um, Thank you, Mark. I just wanted to give you a few words about the Land Conservancy. So welcome to everybody. We're a local land trust, and we've been trying to do a bit of outreach and share information with some of the folks in our area. We were established in 2004, and we are an all-volunteer group. We are a charity, and our mission is to provide permanent safe havens for nature. Currently, we have 13 properties that we're protecting for a total of 452 hectares, or about 1,100 acres. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before we move into introducing Matt. Vicky's asked you if you would try to keep your cameras and mics off during the presentation. We're just trying to protect the bandwidth a little, and that helps a bit. And down at the bottom of your screens, I think probably most of us have become familiar with it, but there's a chat feature. And so if you have questions as we go along, or at the end, there'll be a chance to ask Matt some questions at the end. Please use the chat feature. I will be trying to monitor that as we go along. All right, then, the last thing my job is to do is to welcome Matt and give you a little brief background. Matt did his undergraduate studies at Mount Allison University, where he did research on foraging behavior in northern harriers, and also did a Bachelor of Education in Science and Mathematics. He followed that with a master's degree in behavioral ecology from the University of Calgary. Matt taught science, environmental science and biology at Kingston Collegiate in Kingston for many years, from 1990 to 2020. And he retired from teaching in 2021. He started Bat Check with a focus on educating people about bats and to help homeowners deal with their bat problems, and has switched his focus later to more about bat rehabilitation. Matt, hopefully that gives a reasonable introduction, and I will turn it over to you, and I'm looking forward to the presentation.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Yeah, quite a day. I was kind of hoping for a day like this, not one of those 30-degree days like a week or so ago. I was the teacher that said when the sun comes out and you get your shorts on and your bikes out, it's going to snow 3 more times, and we're almost there. They never believed it. But this gives me a little bit of nightmares, I guess, about my last 2 years teaching with teaching online. And I hope everything goes well. We did a little practice run, so we're going to get right into it. I'm going to start sharing some slides here, and we'll just get confirmation that it's working. Here we go. So far, so good, I hope. Oh, okay, just there we go. So if I can just get confirmation that that's running.
See it.
Okay, so I thought what I often give talks about bats around the world, and they're for audiences from 5 to 95 kind of thing. But I know that you guys are probably a bit more specialized group of naturalists with interest in what's going on out there. So I'm going to tell you a tiny little bit about how I got, I guess, known as Batman. It always makes me chuckle a little bit when I hear the real Batman thing, but I think the criteria are, when I went to do my master's, his name was Robert Barclay, and his wife's name was Robin. So obviously he was the Batman of Calgary. And my little brother's name is Robin too. So I think that's what makes you the real Batman, is having a sidekick named Robin. So as we chuck through here, I did my work in the very, very southern part of Alberta, in the Alberta Hoodoos. And just a fascinating place to go, with all kinds of cracks and crevices for bats to hang out in. That's the Milk River on in the screen there. So I spent a lot of time trundling up on the prairies and down in the rocks and across the water, and marking what bats were doing. Some of the rocks out there have active too. And I was looking for these guys. So the one on top is not a local bat. It's called a long-legged bat, which is only found out west and down through the American West. And the one on the bottom is a little brown bat, which are quite common here. So my study was looking at how similar two animals can be. And I discovered how different they can be acting. So sometimes people put a picture of a bat in their mind, and little kids are thinking dark and scary and blood dripping from their fangs and things. But here are two animals that look almost identical, very similar in size, very similar echolocation calls, but in the environment where they were feeding and spending their lives, they're actually doing quite different things. So you'll notice that some of these guys are banded. So this is a banded bat. They're banded on the wrist. The other one has a band as well. That was for identifying sex and also species while I was doing the study. And it turned out that these two guys are acting quite differently in the prairies out there. After that, I moved to Prince Edward Island, and I was putting articles and papers about bats, the things that I learned about bats while doing my master's. And when Arialis mentioned the problems people were having, this is kind of one of those scenarios. So I wasn't really familiar with this part of the bat world, but all kinds of people, this was in Prince Edward Island, were reading my articles in the paper and then phoning me up and saying, I've got an attic full of bats or a basement full of bats, and lots of concerns about how to move them out and how do I get my house cleaned up and things. So I kind of got into bat relocating there for a little while, and a lot of it was little brown bats. And there was I was actually quite, it was quite heartwarming to hear from people who were concerned about what I was doing, like why you're not getting rid of them, you're not hurting them, not doing any of those things. And a year or two before, someone had come from the mainland, Nova Scotia, to PEI, and had harvested a whole bunch of hibernating bats out of an old basement. And there were pictures in the news and in the papers of these basically grocery bags full of hibernating bats that they claimed to be taking to a cave somewhere and rehabilitating them. So a lot of people were on edge about what was happening. So it was really a neat experience to go around and talk to people about their bat problems and try to help them with their bat problems, and also educate somewhat. This is a little eviction job I was doing in Picton not too long ago. It was one of the last houses that I worked on, but I want you to see the visual here. Up in the above the ladder here, you'll see a little plastic chute, and it's essentially a one-way exit for bats that have been living in this house for a while. And of course, homeowners are trying to move them out. So doing this in a way that's as humane as possible. And I'm going to run the video here so you can see kind of what it looks like at 4 or 5 in the morning when it may not run. I'm going to try that again. Yeah, so just watch for a second here. And these are bats coming home from a night of foraging and finding that their exit and entrance has been modified. So a lot of times what they do is they roost up underneath that plastic bag, and very quickly they'll shuffle out of the house. So it's kind of interesting to, people have had problems with bats for years and years and years. Within a very short period of time, you can actually ask the bats to leave and then cross your fingers and hope they're going to find another place. And it's always a bit of a mixed emotion there. Like some people have seen the bats doing this and then they go like, I want them back in now. But if you've been in an attic with, knee deep in guano and health problems and things like that, then you can see what their motivation is. I've done a little bit of work with bat houses. You may have seen those around as a way of encouraging people to think about bats maybe in a different way that they have in the past. And more recently, I've been doing bat rehabilitation. So this is a group of 4 of 16 bats that came to me in the middle of the winter a couple of years ago. And someone was doing a renovation and moving insulation and stuff around. And these bats were hibernating in the house. These are big brown bats. And was concerned enough to say, I don't want to just put them out in the cold, and ended up finding myself and other wildlife rehab centers around too. And these are little guys that just need a little help to get through the winter and then release back where they came from. So they're all 3 of the 4 have a mealworm in the mouth there. Looks like a stogie. I sometimes get young bats, and I still get calls about these. This is a guy that I call Jules because he showed up in July, and just a remarkable little guy. He what he's sucking on there is a little eyelash or eyeline applicator full of milk, and this little guy managed to grow up, got quite fat by the end of the first summer, and went into hibernation. And the next released them. And you'd see him flying around the yard. By then he had a little band on his wing so you could identify him. And as the fall came around, this guy had never hibernated other than with me. And as fall came around, I was feeding some other bats, and he actually came right back into the barn, landed on the cage where he was last year, and would feed for me and go back and forth. And eventually he went back in and hibernated right in hibernaculum where he came from before, and then did that a subsequent year. So it was really weird to have a bat that sort of started in captivity, was released in the wild, and then under his own choice was to come back and hibernate in my hibernaculum again. So this little guy, I'm hoping to see him soon as he comes out of hibernation. And my wife is a veterinarian, just retired at the same time I did, and we did a lot of work with trying to fix up some bat problems. So this is a little guy. He and his mother were hit by a ceiling fan in an exercise facility in Perth, and we came back after a long weekend, and this call came in that there were 2 bats on the floor. And the mom's wing had to be amputated, and this little guy, her son, actually had a broken humerus, and we actually put it back together and was able to release him too. So I'm doing less and less of that as time goes by. I received 1 bat just before, at the start of the pandemic, I guess it was, and this little bat had a wing injury, and just started to realize that these guys can live to be 40 years old or so. So it's a bit of a long commitment to start them at age 1 and take them through to 40. So it's more about letting people know what bats are up to these days. So I guess the focus of this will be the 8 species that we find, and I understand. So these are the Latin names of the 8 species that you find in the KFLA area. And you'll notice on the list, there's 3 myotis bats. Those names translate into mouse-eared bats. In the middle there's a perimyotis, which is this one. When I was doing my bat research, was called by a totally different name. And now they've come around, they're looking at the genetics and starting to recognize that it may be related to another group. That it kind of looked like at first. We'll get to that in a second. And then the most common bat, whenever I get a call from Kingston or, in the near where I live, it's often in the wintertime, and it's almost always a big brown bat, the Aptesicus fuscus there. So they're a pretty common species in this area. And then the last 3 are ones that are migratory. So you see them from time to time, very rarely in houses, though occasionally. And you'll notice that their Latin names mean hairy tails. So what you may know them by are these names: little brown, eastern small-footed, northern long-eared, the tricolored bat, which used to be called an eastern pipistrelle. And I guess it looked pretty close to some pipistrelles that were found in Europe. So it was given that name, and since then it has become known as a tricolored bat. Big brown, silver-haired, and red, and hoary. So the little stars there indicate relative sizes. So the eastern small-foot bat is the smallest bat in Canada. There's a western small-footed bat that's around the same size, but they're very, very small. And for reference, I use things like toonies and loonies and stuff. A loonie weighs 7 grams, a quarter weighs 5 grams, and a dime weighs 2 grams. So an eastern small-footed bat weighs a little bit less than 2 dimes. At about 3.5 grams. And at the other end of the scale is a hoary bat. So that's the biggest bat in Canada and the biggest bat in our area. They're pretty hard to miss if you ever see one up close. Pretty rarely seen. I'd get 1 or 2 that were delivered to me for some sort of rehabilitation. But even when I was netting for bats doing my master's, you just rarely see these guys. They weigh in at 28 grams. So I always like to tell people that, if you've mailed a letter recently, it cost 28 cents. Sorry, it cost 1 stamp, or it did. Yeah, still does. 1 stamp to mail anything that weighs less than 30 grams anywhere in Canada. So Canada, the biggest bat in Canada, weighs less than what it would take 1 stamp to send it somewhere. Most of my work, I joke about it being called my thesis on feces, was looking at what the bats were doing in the summertime, the way they fly, their echolocation, those kinds of things, but really keyed in on what they're eating. So the two species that I showed you earlier, you'd collect them in a little cotton bag with a number on it. They would go number 2 in the bag, and later in the wintertime, you come back to it and kind of see what these bats are doing. And all of the bats that we have in this area are insectivores. And that probably won't surprise many of you, but I'm always kind of, it's always heartwarming to see, someone brings a bat or has a bat that they found in trouble, and they put it in a box, and almost always you see a little bit of banana or a little bit of apple in there, because many people have heard about and they like the idea of fruit bats, and none of ours will touch fruit. I think the nearest one is a bat that comes up from Mexico into the southern US and drinks nectar and pollinates cactus flowers. But every single one we have are insectivores. But as I mentioned earlier, they're not, insects can be, from big moths to tiny little dipterans and mosquitoes and flies to things like June beetles, which some of these bats eat. So the 8 that we have are equipped for quite different diets, even though they are all insect eaters. But if you can imagine looking through guano, this is stuff that came out in that previous, and from this, when you sort of break it apart, and you can just imagine what that, how you'd have to be equipped in order to pass that through your system, I guess is what I was going to say. The bat droppings look very similar to mouse droppings, and sometimes people will confuse the two, like they know there's something going on in their attic or they're hearing noises. But a bat dropping, if it's dried and you pick it up and just sort of touch it, it'll just go poof and turn into basically pepper. It's very, it's full of all these fragile pieces, whereas mice are eating more seeds and grasses and things, and they're much more fibrous. So you can kind of tell by, just picking at them whether or not they're from bats or from mice. Before we go too far in, people always think about bats as when they're thinking of them fondly, they'll say, well, they eat a lot of mosquitoes, and that's not really true at all. What I found in my thesis while I was picking through thousands and thousands of bat droppings is very rarely do you find signs of mosquitoes in there. In more recent studies where they're using DNA analysis, genetic markers, they find that mosquitoes are really not there. So probably the best predators on mosquitoes are going to be when mosquitoes are in the water. So tadpoles and fish and insects that are living in the water. Whereas when the bats are out foraging at night, mosquitoes aren't really available. There's always that time when you step outside during mosquito season, which is coming up, I guess. And there's a bit of a lull before they find you and follow your breath back to where you are. And they're really not out where they're available to bats, nor are they really an efficient food source. So I liken it to saying, supper's ready, we're having rice, and then throwing the rice out on the lawn, and you'd actually spend more energy trying to find and pick up the rice than you would get back from it. Although there are two species in Canada and one on the list that are quite well known as hovering bats. And I can remember while I was working in Alberta, I was kind of like this person in the picture, just covered with mosquitoes. And these bats are really opportunistic. So with this cloud of insects that were focusing on me, one of these Western long-eared bats came in and started feeding. You could see it right in front of your face, and it would come in and pull the mosquitoes off your jacket. So there are some that will do it when the opportunity arises, but it's not their main food source. Another thing on the list, that three of the 8 are not hibernators. 5 of the 8 are hibernators that you might find in this area in caves and mines and even houses. The 3 that we call migratory, they actually still hibernate, but they go south and they stay in much milder climates. So they tend to wake up more and are more active during what we would call our winter months. And the other ones are devoted, sleeping, slowing down their metabolism and spending the winters that way. So this is a little cluster of big brown bats from just north of Sydenham. And it sometimes surprises people, especially kids, when they think about these bats going into hibernation and, it must be cold, so they must cluster to keep warm. When the reverse is true, you might find clusters of 3 or 4 bats. I think there are 4 in this little clump here, but they're scattered sort of sporadically around in this case, it was a small mica mine. And they're not trying to keep warm, they're actually trying to keep cool. So during the wintertime, they'll wake up from time to time and move to a place where it's slightly warmer, or slightly cooler, or changing the humidity. And even in a single cave, you might find one species that's spending time near the mouth of the cave where perhaps the temperatures are colder, and others are further in where it's a little bit warmer. So when you go into some of these caves used by multiple bats, you'll find that even then they're not just hibernating, they're hibernating under specific conditions. And I think one of the remarkable things here is these guys are essentially, they're breathing maybe once every 3 minutes, and their heart is beating once every 3 or 4 minutes. They're in a state of suspended animation that's just so incredible. And it's one of the things that gives them a very long life. For the size of the animal, they're one of the longest lived mammals on the planet, collectively. And these big brown bats can live to be about 40 years old. And there have been cases of little brown bats at 30 plus years. Whereas the migratory species, they don't tend to live as long. You see records for 10 or 12 years. So it gives you this impression that shutting off your metabolism for 6, 7, 8 months a year is a pretty handy thing for longevity. I often get calls kind of this time of year, a little bit later, and usually what's happened is it's a bat that has kind of run out of fuel. And oftentimes it's a young of the year, young of last year, and did its best to fatten up for winter. And then as it gets thinner and thinner and hungry, it'll wake up and come out. And if there aren't insects around, then it's in real trouble. So those are bats that are pretty easy to help by feeding them and hopefully get them back on the wing again. So you might, if you're out there tootling around in the woods and the wetlands and things and seeing bats, I wanted to give you a way of trying to identify them in hand. And this is actually quite difficult for some of them and very easy for others. I remember when I first started with little browns and long-leggeds, the reason I chose them is because they're so similar. And it was a very subtle little bump on what's called the calcar down near the calcaneus, essentially a little what's called a keeled calcar, which was the main identifying feature. And it was so otherwise they look the same. But when I held them in hand, the attitude was totally different. So I worked with little browns, which I sometimes call bitchy bats, because I was trying to measure their wings and hold them out flat and getting wing areas and tail areas and stuff. And they would just chew on your knuckles and chew on your hands. So I had to sort of duct tape up and prepare my hands in preparation for measuring these things. Whereas long-legged bats would sit there quietly, they just sort of buzz and they'd be like, everything's cool, when you're done, just let me go. So again, they look the same. They're really not the same animal. They're quite different. So some of these are just very easy things that you could see by looking and say, it's got to be one of these. Then as you'll see, it gets a little bit more specific for some of the ones that look a lot more the same. And when you're classifying bats in this area, the first thing is the tail enclosed or does it have a wrinkled face? And if that's the case, then it's not a bat from around here. So the one on the left is a picture of a bat I took from Costa Rica. And if you kind of look at, hopefully you can see my cursor here, the tail sort of ends partway down. And if you look at it from the back, it's like a little antenna that sticks up. Or you'll see Mexican free-tailed bats that don't have any membrane, this wing tail membrane in between the legs here. So all of our bats will have a tail that goes right down through the middle, sticks out, and the tail is a bit more pointy than what you see in this photo. And none of them have faces like this. So if you see this, you know it's something that doesn't, well, not that it doesn't belong here, but it's not local. I had a call from a friend of mine who does a lot of wildlife rehab, prevention, I guess, in houses. And he was so excited. He said, I think I've got this bat for you. And I said, when I heard what it was, I'm like, bring it in. And that's when you stop the class and show everybody this little bat. So if it has black fur or dark brown with sort of white tips, then you've got this bat right here. And it's very easy to distinguish from all the rest. It's called a silver-haired bat. You can see the silver hairs. Very broad ears. The ears on some bats are really long. And one of the distinguishing features you'll see later is you take that ear and fold it down and see if it sticks out beyond its nose or whether it doesn't. And these guys, their ears are about as wide as they are tall. And it's a silver-haired bat. So these guys weigh in at about 11 grams. So that would be a loonie is 7 and a quarter is 5. That's 12. So they're about $1.25. They're mostly tree roosting, but occasionally show up in houses, and they are great migrators. So in this area, they'll kind of pass through and spend a lot of their time further north, and then they'll come back through. So you kind of see them in two waves. Actually, before I got to this, I'll put this out rhetorically. I was gonna say, I've heard that 7 of the 8 species that we have in this area have been found on KFLA land trust lands. And I was just curious about which one hasn't been found, but I have an inkling of which one that might be.
Actually,
Second thing, does the bat have really dense fur on its tail? Sorry?
I was just going to say, Matt,
Go
we
ahead.
have found all 8.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Some might be harder to find than others, but
Definitely.
that's cool. Yeah. I think I found 7 of the 8, so you're ahead of me. So if you haven't worked with bats up close before, or maybe if you've seen a big brown or a little brown, they've got bare tails, like just a sort of dark brown membrane. And if you hold it up to the light, you can see the blood vessels and things as the light shines through. But 2 of our species, plus the last one, the silver-haired, are so easy, they don't even have to worry about, easy to identify, you don't have to worry about this one, but does it have fur on its tail? And if so, it's probably this one or this one. So this is a bat that I caught in my backyard not a couple of years ago, and you see the tail here is completely furred. And this one is, it's got its tail kind of wrapped up over the top here. So if you see that fur, you're looking at a lazurin. So if it's got sort of yellowish around its face and is big, this is the hoary bat. Or some of you are probably familiar with hoarfrost. So sometime in the spring and the fall, you'll get moisture in the air and then a cold snap and all the trees are covered with a silvery frosting called a hoarfrost. And that's where this name comes from. So this guy's being held by a friend of mine who was doing work at Delta Marsh in Manitoba and banding and marking and using radioactive tracers to find out the activity of these bats. And they found that they will travel over 100 kilometers per night, not like 50 out and 50 back, but they're our fastest flying species and will travel quite a distance in time. They roost in trees, and you can't see it in this picture. You might see it better here. If you look at the wing, it's kind of a brownish red color. And what they'll do is hang in a tree and themselves in their leaves and be indistinguishable from a bunch of old leaves. And the same thing when they're young or born, they almost always have twins, and the babies will hang belly to belly. Their bellies have no fur, their backs and tails have fur, and they'll hang in this little cluster and keep each other warm and invisible essentially from down below. So again, don't see them very often. When you do, you're in the presence of greatness with the hoary bats. And the other one is with the furry tail are the red bats, sometimes called northern red bats. And these are 2, when I was doing a lot of bat shows, I would just put up a net the night before and see what I would get. And at my neighbor's place, I would catch big brown bats coming out of his barn. And just for fun, I put a net in my backyard. I hadn't really seen many around here. And immediately right over, we had a swimming pool at the time, and they came in over the pool and I caught 2 red bats. So this is a male on the left, which has got tend to be stronger, richer, reddish orange color, and a female on the right, which is a bit browner. Not quite as red, but still pretty easy to spot. And you'll also notice a distinctive, when the wing opens up, they've got a very distinctive white spot near the wrist here and back here. So pretty easy to tell. You might confuse it somewhat for the hoary bat, but these guys are about less than half the size, less than half the mass. So they still are a pretty good sized bat in terms of wingspan, but a bit smaller. These guys also hold the record. I always like to, at bat shows, like talk to kids mostly about like what animal has the biggest ears in the world. And a lot of times we think of exotic creatures living, in faraway lands and stuff, but the biggest ears in the world belong to a bat relative to its size that lives here in Canada. And this bat has the record for the most number of babies of any bat in the world. On average, they usually have 2 to 3 babies, but occasionally they'll have 5 babies. And sometimes the mom is trying to carry these 5 babies around, and it's a tough flight. Just imagine putting your 5 children on your back and going to work or going for groceries. So that's the red bat. And those are the 3 sort of foliage tree roosting species. And they're also kind of here, they're not staying around all winter, they're passing through. Now it gets a little bit tougher. So if you don't have those first 3, you got to start looking at the teeth. And I've pointed out the canine teeth, which is familiar to anybody who has cats or dogs. And then behind that is a premolar. So these are the molars back here. And the premolar is this little one. So does it have 1? or does it have one or two? So if it has just one large premolar, it's this guy. And the photo that they used to introduce me there, learn about bats, was a big brown bat. And I'm not suggesting you play around with the pointy end of these ones or any of them. You don't want to be bitten by them. The very first one I caught, I had been working with little brown bats and long-legged bats. And then I caught a hoary bat. Sorry, it's not a hoary bat. This is a big brown bat. And they are quite a bit more, a lot stronger. They can give a very good bite. They can draw blood, all of these things that I didn't really have to worry about with the little browns. But you can kind of see in this shot, very dramatic canine. And then behind it, you can see that one large premolar. So I also often talk to people about, like, does it have this big like patch or puffy spot on the side of its nose? And big browns have pretty distinctive broad faces, and they will kind of hiss at you too. They sound a little bit like a snake when you pick them up. A couple of other shots. I want to include this one. This is Jules, the little baby that was drinking milk earlier. They don't all look like this. This is that I'm holding an insect just outside of the picture, and it's like, cool, lunch. And yet it kind of looks vicious, I guess you could say. And here's with his mouth closed. I'll also point out another little bat anatomy thing here. So this little guy here is called the tragus. So this is the pinna, your normal ear for, cats and dogs and horses and things, and you. And then this is the tragus inside. And nobody knows exactly what that's for, but these folds in the ear and this thing seem to be related to isolating the direction of an echo. So when they use echolocation, they can move these around and help, I guess, clarify the sound coming in. And in humans, sometimes kids in class, I'd point out the tragus and there'd be a kid with a tragal piercing right in the middle of their ear. And they thought that was kind of cool. I guess you can point out that you don't need to get this from me, but bats are not blind. These bats, they're easiest to catch in the field. We would catch them just at dusk because they'd come out of wherever they were sleeping for the day, and they would fly down traditional pathways, to a brook or something to get a drink. And they weren't using their sonar yet. So they're you would use very, very fine nets called mist nets that they couldn't see. But later on, when they were using their sonar, their echolocation calls, they could easily pick out those nets. And I've actually seen them fly up to a net, stop, hover. One actually dropped into the water, swam underneath it, and then took off from the other side. So when they're using their sonar, they're pretty adept at avoiding traps. This is another big brown bat, and take a look at the teeth here. So the canines, these guys are eating things that have exoskeletons, right? Insects, and big browns are quite well known for eating things like June beetles. And over time, 30, 40 years, over time, that crunching through exoskeletons flattens out your teeth. So they become a little less, looks more like a hippopotamus than a bat. So it happens over time. Just for relative, I see a lot of big brown bats, so I have more pictures of them, but this is a big brown bat skull, which is considered robust in the bat world. And this is a chipmunk. So to give you a sort of a relative size there, you can get a feel for how small they actually are. And some of these skulls, when you prepare them this way, it's actually hard to pick them up because they're so fragile, but they work. So we've done the big brown. So next is the canine in front of one or two small premolars. So the one big premolar was on the big browns, and here we step into the premolars and you get one or two, but they're much smaller than what we saw on the big browns. Like the big brown, these ones you probably wouldn't notice because the bats are a lot smaller. And again, I'm not advocating that you poke around in their mouths, but this is to help identify them. So it has one. It's the tricolored bat, and they range in about 7 grams, so the weight of a loonie. And if it has two, again, hard to identify, then it's one of the myotis. So we've got 3 different myotis to identify, and those are the ones, including and with the tricolored bats, that'll be harder to distinguish between them. I have no photos of a tricolored bat. Not one. I took a picture of one years ago, and it's on a slide somewhere that I wasn't able to find. But I just remember I had a little brown at the time, and what was then called an eastern pipistrelle. And if you blow on the fur, you'll see that the fur sort of opens up, and you'll see gray at the base, and then sort of yellow underneath. So hence the the species name subflavus, or under yellow. And then the top is kind of brown. So they look like the other 3 myotis until you sort of blow on their fur. So this is a shot of a couple of the well, I'll just say generic bats for now. So these are bats that are hanging out in someone's house, and they haven't got any of the other characteristics. Those two little tiny premolars, saying that this is a myota species. So now we start freaking around with their ears, and you fold the ear forward, and if it goes beyond the tip of its nose and it has little tiny feet, so less than 1 centimeter long foot, then we're getting this guy. So what we have in this area is called the Eastern small-footed bat at about 3.8 grams. And the picture I have is a Western small-footed bat. So these guys are not local. These guys have the sort of blonde fur, and they used to be known as masked bats, but just adorable. This one is sitting on my finger. This one weighed in at about 3.2 grams, I think it was. And Eastern small-footeds look the same. They're really, really tiny and have glossy brown fur instead of this blonde fur. So again, I have not caught an Eastern small-footed bat yet, but that's what they look like. This one's sitting on my thumb. So if you kind of look at your thumb and figure out his body length there, the whole body length is pretty small. Body length on the Eastern small-footed is 8.3 centimeters. So tiny little bat. If it's ear, so take a look at this guy, all of a sudden the ears got much bigger. We'll just go back for reference. Oh, sorry, back for reference here. Ears would go just beyond the tip of its nose, and this one goes quite a bit further. So, and the other thing is it doesn't have a fringe on its tail, so a fringe of hairs. We have a bat called the fringe bat that has a lot of hair on its tail, on the tip of its tail. So with black ears and very long ears that fold more than 5 millimeters beyond the tip, you're talking a Western long-eared bat. Whenever I'd catch these out west in Alberta, it was always exciting. I think I've only ever caught 4 or 5 in my life, but they just look like an exotic bat with those ears. And if they still fold beyond the tips, but not quite as far, then we're getting into Keen's long-eared bat, and those are only found out in BC. So we're looking at the long-eared ones, and then this is the one that we have, the northern long-eared bat. And again, ears are a little bit more rounded. They don't fold out quite as far. This is a borrowed picture, so it's not one that I took myself, but the previous one has a spot, an ill-defined spot, and I challenge you to find the spot on the shoulders there for Keen's long-eared bat from out west. This one doesn't have that spot, so it's kind of nice that they only live in the longest ears in this area is going to be a northern long-eared bat, and they're just little at 5.2 grams, weight of a quarter. And then we get to probably what used to be one of the most common bats. Like these guys are found all across North America and down into the States and Central America. And the description, short ears, not going beyond the tip of the nose. We put forward no calcar, so that's kind of looking at its feet and the little structures that hold the tail. Long glossy fur, brown to black ears. We're getting into the little brown bat. So the only one you could confuse, sorry, not the only one, but one that you could confuse that, there's a little guy out west called the Yuma bat. And it looks a lot like a little brown bat. And now we get into much more subtle differences of measuring forearms and feet and et cetera to figure them out. So there's the little brown. A couple of, so those are the 8 species that we have. I wanted a couple of other kind of field things. If you've never looked at a bat really closely, you may know that they're called chiropterans or hand-winged. And what you're looking at here is the left hand of a big brown bat, and you can see all the blood vessels that are going out here. When we found that mother bat that had been hit by a ceiling fan, she had no circulation from this point on, and she actually lost her arm right up at the elbow. She could still fly to me with one wing, but she was going to lose this wing, so she had to have it amputated. If you hold your hand up, you'll see the thumb sticks up, and there's a little hook there that they walk and cling from. First and second fingers, this doesn't show the whole length of all the way out to the tip, but the first and second fingers go to the tip of the wing. And then the third and the fourth, this would be the equivalent of a baby finger here, goes the full width of the wing all the way down. So I always tease kids at Halloween when they're trying to draw bats and, they're doing these loop-de-loops at the bottom of the wing. How many should you put in? Well, there should be one that goes to the tail down further, one here, and that's it. So you get 3 little loop-de-loops if you count the tail. But none of that matters. What I want to show you here is if you see one up close, a lot of people ask about how do you tell how old they are? And I've got some on my screen, I've got something covering up the view here, but take a look at the knuckles. So just go out one of the fingers here, either one of these guys, until you get to that first little joint. And you're going to see it's what's called an ossified joint. So it turns hard. And before that, it's cartilage. So for the first 6 months or so, or kind of the first year, so if a bat is born in May or June here, right up until probably September, October, that first several months of its life, you could tell that it was young of the year. After that, you would see this kind of the ossified joint. So here's the wing of a baby bat. And I'm just holding in my fingers. This is the thumb here. Now you can see there's the 1 loop, 2 loop, 3 loops, but look at the knuckles, right? Right in here, you can see that the light is coming through. They haven't ossified yet. They're still cartilaginous. Plus it's quite small, but you just hold the bat up to the light and you see the light coming through and you know that it's young of the year, which is kind of helpful sometimes. I'm going to try getting some calls here. So again, these are typically not part of our world. We go out and, you know, might see a bat flying by. It's a very distinctive calls. And on this one, I'll show you a sonogram later, but on this, I'm hoping I can play. First of all, there's a big brown bat, and they have a call that's almost audible to humans. Sometimes when you're with big brown bats and they're flying around, you get the feeling that they're there. You don't necessarily hear them, although sometimes they give squeaks and squawks that are certainly audible, but they have this sort of pulsing. And I've taken them into classrooms before, my own classroom, and hold them up to show the class, and they'll get what I call the launch look. So they start blasting sonar around the room, and every girl in the room heard it. None of the guys heard it. So girls are more tuned into the higher frequencies, and these guys are right at the cusp of that frequency. So again, it goes big brown, and there's a little bit of a space, and then you'll hear a little brown, which is much higher frequency call. Then it jumps to a bat from Africa called a yellow-winged bat, and you'll see why I included that. And then the last one is a bat that it's not considered a sonar bat, but it's one that clicks its tongue. So it's an Egyptian fruit bat. So I'm going to hopefully you'll be able to hear this. Let's see here. So that jumped ahead. Oops. That jumped ahead to Little Browns. Let me see if I can get her back to the start. I think I was impatient there. Here we go. It's hard to know how patient to be. Okay. So that's a big brown bat. Little noise here, and it goes to little brown bats. These are slowed down 16 times so you can hear them. It'll be a click and then some bats. So those are bats just foraging, flying around the yard. You'd swear that was a chicken, baby chicken. The next one is a yellow-winged bat from Africa. Totally different strategy. So it sounds like a kid with a whistle, right? Very, very long, all the same frequency. We'll get to what that means in a second. And the last one is a bat clicking its tongue, not true sonar. So that the last one there was they're able to get into, you know, dark caves and things like that, but they don't have the acuity to be able to pick up insects and things like that. So they can sort of help their way around in a world when it's dark. So these are the two species that I worked at. And in those 4 calls you heard earlier, we get something called a constant frequency call. So this, where it says volans, this is a constant frequency, all at the same, like that whistle we heard. And then we get FM, or frequency modulated bats. So they tend to start, sorry, my cursor's jumping around. They start at a high frequency and drop down to a lower frequency. And on the bottom, you can see a duration as well. So if we look at the bats, and this is most of the bats in our area, you'll find hoary bats have a very low call, definitely within in the audible range. There's one out west called the spotted bat, and they come, their sonar calls come way down. So I've heard them in a Soyuz in the interior BC at the bottom. If you go out at nighttime, you'll hear this. It sounds like a sonar, like a submarine ping, ping, ping sound flying across the lake. And then for our little browns and small footeds, what you'll notice, these guys are very high frequency. So they stop at about, humans can hear to about 20 kilohertz, or to the top of our hearing is right about here. So this is, as I say, the big brown bats come close enough for some of us with young ears and good hearing to be able to pick out these sort of pulses. But what happens with these small-footed bats and the long-eared bats is they are really good at adept at finding things that are not flying. So they could, for example, come up to a side of a tree where there's a moth roosting, and you can sort of imagine this vertical call going out and wrapping itself around the moth and then coming back with a different shape, and they're able to pick up solitary things, or things that are sedentary. Whereas something like a hoary bat, which is more of a constant frequency call, all at around 20 kilohertz or so, it's like a shaft going out into the night, like a spear. And if you imagine a moth flying in front of it, or some sort of insect, its wings are pulsing. And as that spear, the echo comes back, it would have these little pulses in it. So different kinds of bats are using different kinds of calls, which are good for finding different kinds of prey at different time. And it's pretty amazing to hear these. Some of you may have heard of bat detectors, or I know there's a little company that sells you a bat detector that you can build, and to go out at night, and what happens is you'll hear these click, click, clicks going through the sky that you couldn't hear before. And I know there's some monitoring of bats down on, is it not Howe Island, but near Kingston there, to look at what species are showing up on the islands. And I wanted to include these guys. I think there's been maybe one case of this bat showing up in Canada, and it was somewhere in southwestern Ontario. This is a pallid bat, and I wanted to include them because they're sometimes known as whispering bats. So instead of flying, making very loud calls looking for prey, these guys listen. They'll sit and wait and listen for the prey to walk by, and then often pounce on them. So they're capable of using sonar, but they're using their hearing, acute hearing, to pick up these insects and things that are moving by. And this one, as you go further south, they're one of the few bats in the world that eat scorpions for a living too. Everybody probably by now has heard about white nose syndrome. This is not my photograph, but this is kind of what it looks like in an extreme case. So this is a fungal infection that bats will pick up sometimes in caves. And there's a lot of concern, there has been a lot of concern about people spelunkers going from cave to cave and carrying the spores with them and going to a new cave and introducing it. And it has really decimated a lot of our insectivorous bats. The hibernating bats would be more susceptible to this. So as they're going into hibernation, they may pick up these spores, and those spores enter their lungs and start to grow. And when the bat is so essentially the fungus is feeding off of the bat and the food that bat has accumulated. And as spring comes around, or as the winter goes on, the bat becomes emaciated and will often die from it. So there are studies showing that their bats are coming back from this, but bats have a very low reproductive rate, typically one baby per year. Red bats are an exception with 2 to 5 kind of thing. But white nose syndrome is still a concern. I also want to mention bats have all exactly the same body parts we have in terms of our bones. So, you can find odd things like down here, you can see the leg, and this would be a knee, and they're kind of rotated outwards so that their feet, the bottom of their feet, they're able to, it kind of faces their face, so they're able to bend their knees and put food into their mouth. The one bone that bats have that we don't, so they've got one extra one, is called a baculum, and a baculum is a penis bone, and they're used for identifying some of the bats, like the tricolored bat. They're using the baculum to try to identify who it's most closely related to, and they are looking, they're kind of not a myotis, and they're kind of like silver-haired bats. So they're kind of an in-between group. Yeah, so that's a big brown bat. I also want to mention this for if you have a bat in hand, a lot of times people ask, is it male or female? Males are pretty obvious, pretty well endowed. Females, you can sometimes, you can pick them out if they don't have a penis, but if they're in the springtime, this is probably an important thing for things like bat biology. When I was doing my research, we catch a bat and immediately look to see if they're lactating. So most bats will have 2 nipples, one on each side. The lousy urine bats have 4. And if they're lactating, that means they've got young back at home, and we would always release them right away, like collect a few fecal samples and then off they would go. So otherwise, anatomically, just like us. To track these bats, this is a friend of mine when I was doing my master's. Sometimes to find out what they're doing at night is difficult. And some of the bats are so small that putting trackers on them to find out what they're doing is tough. But if you look really closely here, I think it comes in the next slide, in his hand, you can see the bat and you can see a little orange, sorry, a little green light. So that's just simply one of those lights that you crack. And what we would do is we'd take out the 2 different chemicals and we'd put them into a little pill capsule. And then using surgical cement, we'd glue it onto the back of the bat or the belly of the bat. And this guy would say, releasing bat, whatever. And then we'd have a team set up to follow these bats all night, running through the dark and looking for these little green lights in the trees and over the water. And that's one of the ways I was used to identify that the little brown bats that I was working with, and the ones that you find here, they spend 80%, 85% of their time flying right over the surface of the water, very, very close, and picking up the kinds of insects they find there. And the long-legged bats that I was working with, and if you look at things like hoary bats and big brown bats, they fly much higher. Big brown bats, they don't actually drink all that much. They don't come to water, whereas some of the smaller ones, the first thing they do is they head for water. So this little light enabled us to kind of get a feel for the behavior of the bats, what they're doing in the wild. And I remember tagging a Western smallfoot bat one time, and I ran along beside it. It's a slow flying bat, and I'm running across the prairie. There's a little green light in the air beside me, and I know that the bat is there. And we went way out into the open prairie, and then the bat dropped and went under a rock. And I would never have known that that's one of the places that they hang out. So there's some unusual behaviors, like, for example, the tricolor bats. Apparently, they like to set up roosts in lichens, so beard lichens. Not the kind of thing you expect. We're always looking under bark and cracks and crevices and stuff, but some of them are using things that we're not necessarily expecting. Every time, so that last shot showed a way of looking for what the bats are doing when they're out there flying at night. This one is a bat that has been in rehabilitation or hibernation with me for some reason. And I always have to know that they're maneuverable, that they're flying well before I let them go. So just watch for a second here as this big brown takes its first flight. This is in a little hoop house that I have. And this guy says, I can turn the corners, I can land, everything is good. And that's always an exciting moment where you take this bat back to where it came from. You'll also notice in a lot of bat photos, there are always fingers or gloves, or, unless you've got special infrared cameras and things like that. So I watched this bat for a fair bit, and he always would go past this panel, and I managed to get my only free flight shot that I've ever taken. So this is a big brown bat. You can see the elbows, you can see the forearms, you can see the fingers working. He's on a turn. You can see the tail, the legs are pumping, all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of gratifying to be able to see one of these things without our impediment, other than the big plastic house that it happens to be in at the time. So I'll leave off with Jules. This is Jules again, the little one that was drinking milk at the start. That left and has come back for 3 years in a row now. And I'll open it up for questions. If you have any questions you'd like to ask me. I'm not sure if this is going to go through Mary Alice or if I turn on chat.
I've made notes of a few.
Oh, okay.
First, thank you so much. So there've been a few questions, and I'll just go through them.